The Green Burial Council is grateful for the River Styx Foundation returning as lead sponsor for our second annual conference, Green Life, Death, and Future, and providing critical early support. The River Styx Foundation provides a bridge to our ecology by funding projects that demonstrate the potential for healing and beauty, including those that have been ignored previously or are emerging. Primary focus areas of the River Styx Foundation include promoting greater acceptance of death and dying, and green burial practices. The Green Burial Council thanks Good Ending, the supporting sponsor for the Green Life, Death, and Future conference session, GPS Mapping for Cemetery Planning and Memorialization. Good Ending seeks to improve end-of-life outcomes, and through its website, goodending.org, provides information, tools, and resources spanning a broad range of end-of-life matters, including green burial.
In our session today, Dr. Megan Sawyer and Mel Bennett will discuss how Dr. Sawyer is using mapping to plan the forest land of Mel Bennett's Life Forest Conservation Cemetery in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, and to incorporate burial data. Dr. Megan Sawyer is an associate professor of mathematics at Southern New Hampshire University. Their research is based on modeling biological systems using physiologically based pharmacokinetic or PBPK modeling techniques. Mel Bennett holds a degree in anthropology and sociology and is a co-founder of Life Forest. And with that, I will hand it off to Mel to start the presentation.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Life Forest is a cemetery in New Hampshire. Like many people within this group that I'm learning, I have come to find myself in the death care industry from an outside industry. And there were certain aspects that I wanted to approach in a way that would be maybe a little bit different than the way it's currently done. And this is one of those ways. Oh, that's me with my hair done. Let's move on. Here's Dr. Sawyer to my right, or is it on the left because it's on the screen? Okay, so we've heard a little bit about us. So the information provided in this course, it relates only to Life Forest Conservation Cemetery practices and procedures. Please be aware that all burial grounds, scattering forests or gardens, conservation cemeteries, natural burial grounds, they're going to have their own practices and procedures. And this talk is intended for educational purposes in discussing how technology can be incorporated into choosing, planning, and recording cemetery-related activities. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of burial, as all of your cemetery keeps understand. So as we kind of really dug into, no pun intended, the soul of what we're trying to accomplish here, we believe that the importance of burial is preserving ancestry. What we understand is that tradition is not about the headstone versus a tree, but tradition lies in the hearts of the people that are buried below them. Somebody's recipes, family stories, all of the things that make that person that you are burying special, and the marks that they left in their loved ones' hearts and in their families. And so as cremation rates rise, in New Hampshire, we're at 80% cremation. We were trying to think of a better, more eco-friendly option with the planting of a tree, and also how to preserve tradition without the idea of scattering and perhaps losing that sense of place, that ability not only to visit, but the record keeping that cemeteries offer. So we're going to think about, this is a little bit of my background and personal journey here to Life Forest. In the upper right hand picture, you're going to see a photo of myself in my 20s, and that's my mother, not my sister. Okay. So that's my mother and I, and she was a lovely, kind woman, but she fell very ill, and I became part of that sandwich generation that a lot of your families are probably experiencing. So in the bottom screen, you can see my mother at 51, close to what my age is now. You'll also see my little girl, Natalie, and we are taking care of her. And I'm taking care of Natalie, my mom, and another small child at that time as well, who was taking the photograph. So what I learned was that my mother spent her life raising myself and my brother, and she didn't have advanced degrees, and she didn't have any high awards of anything. She was a homemaker and an amazing woman and a great mom. And I also found that when she passed very young, I was handed this feeling of responsibility of protecting her legacy and the mark that she left on the world. So legacy, as we talk about, and what are we protecting, is the richness of an individual's life. The fact that she always sat by our side when we were ill. She was kind. She was sweet and compassionate and inclusive. But then we also talk about the ancestry. So when I was in my mid-20s, I traveled all the way to Sweden because I wanted to find the burial site of my great-great-great-grandfather. And I did find his burial site, and I learned a lot about my family. But that journey also taught me a lot about myself as a person, my experiences in the travel, of seeing new places, of relating to places I've never even been before. So that burial, that cemetery on that remote hill in Sweden allowed me to have that experience. And as I look at what our cemeteries are offering, I'm thinking a lot about the fact that I would like my children to be able to have that experience. And so that's why scattering was not an option for me. So our cemetery, as well as many of the cemetery keeps that are here, what are we trying to protect? Well, obviously, we're trying to help protect the environment. We want to work towards a natural environment, one that's welcoming. We also want to provide community. We want to bring people together, much like this Green Burial Council is doing right now. We're bringing people together who share the same interests and passions. So on the left-hand side, you're going to be able to see that my mom's tree at first burial was very kind of just looked like sticks, not much. But then on the right-hand side, you'll see my little girl. She was the same one that was standing next to my mom's wheelchair. And you can see there's some flowers on the tree. And as simple as that is, seeing those flowers for the first time, it reminded me of my mom and her smile. And there's something about the fact that there's a life in her memorial monument. So as we can see here, and this is a tough slide for me because that's my dad who passed away, and his funeral was last weekend. However, he was very supportive and engaged in what we were offering at Life Forest. And I think that the role of a cemetery caretaker and the role we try to ensure that we give and offer to the families is compassion. We really want to make sure that people feel heard and they're understood, and they can play a role in burial in which they would like to play. It's not being dictated to them on how it's supposed to happen. So the other part of technology and memorial markers and green cemetery is, just the thought of what are memorial markers. So in traditional cemeteries, headstones mark the location of a burial. And, in the past, we've always seen that those headstones are located on some sort of map, and that's what allow people to find these places again. So a lot of questions around a more eco-friendly burial or a green burial is, well, how would people find them if there's no headstone? In this light is where we bring in technology. So technology can protect the location of burial in the absence of a headstone. Of course, we have a tree in our instance, and there are a lot of green burial that offer, small mementos or little rocks, or there's ways to find them. But this technology is integrated far beyond the point of place on the actual land. So this is the benefit of using technology. So at Life Forest, what we have chosen to do is provide a QR code for people who would like that sort of memorialization. And this is a way that we chose to integrate technology. We offer a complimentary celebration of life page where people can upload videos and pictures of the person or the pet that's buried there or together or whatnot. This is a simple 2-inch square that's placed at the base of their tree. They can scan the square, and that square will bring up whatever information the family or the person wanted reflected about themselves. And that's the beauty that I think technology offers. There's an equity. What I did not like about my cemetery experiences is that you could walk into a cemetery, see a giant angel carved of expensive materials, and then right next to it, a very small stone that you could barely read the writing on. And it always occurred to me that it didn't seem fair, that it didn't seem like just because somebody could afford a giant angel didn't mean that the person that could only afford a small stone was loved any less. So I believe, and we believe at Life Forest, that if we can use technology appropriately, it can bring an equity to the memorialization. And in 2 inches, it takes up a lot less valuable environmental space than a huge angel or even just a small stone. So now we're going to talk about preserving the legacy of the land using GIS, and I'm going to pass this along to my good friend and associate, Dr. Sawyer.
Thanks, Mel.
You're welcome.
So on the idea of preserving the equity of the land and preserving the idea of space and environmental context, it's important to know how mapping can help conservation cemeteries formulate a plan for building out what they want to do, how they can best use the land, what is the best land. So geographic information systems, or GIS, as I'll refer to it through this talk, GIS mapping helps provide that framework for decision-making based on spatial data. And the spatial data can be used to create maps, conduct analysis of underlying trends, and interpret causal relationships, such as the relationships between roads and conservation areas, or the relationships between the slope and where the wetlands are and how that might affect the trees that you might plant in those areas. And so for conservation cemeteries, GIS mapping really helps you figure out, is this the best place? Is this the best use? And is this the appropriate use of the land for not only the cemetery, but for the environment in general? So useful data for conservation cemeteries is political boundaries, such as roads and types of roads. For example, if you have a class 6 road that never gets plowed in the winter, you might not want your cemetery on that. Different townships lines, different towns have different cemetery laws. And so it might be important for you to figure out, well, if I place my cemetery across 2 townships, I want to make sure my conservation cemetery respects the legal boundaries of each township. Useful data includes watershed and wetlands information. If you have national wetlands on your cemetery land, you have to make sure to preserve that as an area not to plant in. Soil information determines the types of trees and bushes that you can plant. You don't want to plant a tree that will die 5 years later because it's malnourished. And then topographical information, such as the elevation, the average slope. If you have a conservation cemetery built on the side of a mountain, is it going to be accessible to visitors in years to come, to meet their family, to travel to see their great-great-great-grandfather?
That's right.
So to start with data, conservation cemeteries either need existing conservation land or during the development of the cemetery, creation of conservation land. GIS mapping can help identify regions where land for conservation cemeteries might be viable using publicly available databases. In New Hampshire, there's the granite.nh.edu, where they have a conglomerate of different GIS mappings. So when you're interested in looking at different GIS data sets, look at your publicly available data set to see what your state, what your county, what your locality has available for you to get started. So what we'll do next in this next portion of the talk is look at an example of GIS mapping in action with an example plot in Henniker, New Hampshire. This is not the Life Forest plot. I just want to be very clear. This is not the Life Forest Cemetery. It is an example plot that I've canned up to give an idea of what GIS mapping can do. I'll go through some static slides first to preserve, so that way you can, when you have access to these slides later, you can refer back to what I've spoken about. And then toward the end of the talk, I'll bring up the GIS program that I use and dynamically work through some slides so you can see what happens in action. And feel free at any point in time to put questions in the chat about technical questions for the talk. And I'm happy to answer these as you go along.
How do we see the chat?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, and the moderator will ask the questions of me, so feel free for that. So here, take the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire is broken up into some large number of counties. I forget off the top of my head how many counties there are. I am not a New Hampshireite by birth, so I am bad in my geography class. But I do know that that county marked in black on the right-hand side is the county of Henniker, New Hampshire. And so what we're going to do is we can look at this map and we can say, this is information in a map. This is geographic information data. County markers are data. And so looking at this data, what we can do is we can break it down and we can say, oh, let's look at the roads in this data. So this is Henniker, and these are all the major roads in Henniker, New Hampshire. So this is another layer of data that we can incorporate. So not all the roads are labeled because we haven't zoomed in far enough to see all the roads. And so that's okay. For example, we don't need to see downtown's roads because we're not far enough out. And we also can look at the current conservation lands in Henniker. So we can see that Henniker has a large amount of conservation lands. It turns out that much of this conservation land is along a watershed. And so we would, if we were looking for a conservation cemetery, we would be careful about how we chose our conservation cemetery if we were to abut conservation lands based on the wetlands areas that we have. But this is, again, another layer of data that we can consider. So let's suppose that we had a hypothetical plot here. Somebody said, hey, here's 40 acres of land. Is this of interest to you? It's right off of Locust Lane. It's not too far from downtown Henniker. It's not a budding conservation cemetery or conservation land, but you could conceivably add some conservation cemetery or conservation land into your cemetery area. So looking at this land, we can zoom in and we can say, all right, what's going on with this land? Currently, I have this land shaded and color coded, and I'll talk about what the color coding is, but we can see there's kind of some distinct regions in this land. And it turns out that these regions are based on the soil type, the soil slope, and the soil, just different types of the soil gradation. So when we look at the soil drainage as one of the classifications of the soil type, we can see that there's several areas of moderately drained soil and some areas of poorly drained soil. So if I was looking to plant a tree, I can see that the orange area in the central part of the image here is very poorly drained. So I would not want to plant a tree that needs high drainage versus the area that's on the kind of the two sides of the orange area are moderately well drained. So I can plant things like perhaps maples or dogwood trees, which need a bit of drainage more so than something that's like a cottonwood tree, which does well against water. Not that I think cottonwood trees are native to New Hampshire.
But I think the other point in this is that being able to understand the soil and the soil content as far as what amount of density, if you're working in a drained soil versus a not drained soil with regards to green burial is very important actually for breakdown of bodies. So
Yes, very much.
what you need to know kind of like where your water levels are and how far away you are from water.
Exactly how far away the water is, and we'll get to that in a moment. Also, the soil type itself could be important. So peat versus loam versus a complex sort of soil. We see we've got different types of sandy loam soil here. So this is a lot of information that we get from a single data source about soil. We also see that we have grades. So this is the grade of the land at that moment. So along Locust Lane, we have a very steep grade of 12%. So it's a very sharp dip down into this land. And then we have grades of 4% into this kind of drained area of a 1% grade. So we can see kind of visualizing the topography of this land. And so it makes sense that the area in 1 that's marked 1 is a drainage area. It's kind of a catch basin from the other areas. And in fact, using the National Wetlands Inventory, we see that it is marked as a wetlands area. And so we would want to be careful not to plant in that area because, or bury in that area, because we would have, we would be planting on national and burying on national wetlands, which would be prohibited and also would affect the decomposition process. So one issue or one thing that we really are interested in doing is combining the GIS mapping where we get an idea of what's happening with the technology with the cemetery records. And this is what Life Force had approached me about, was how do we get technology and cemetery records and mapping and getting all these pieces combining together. And so this is where GIS technology really shines. And the question is, what can GIS mapping do that spreadsheets can't?
Okay, just to me.
Yeah.
So I had approached Dr. Sawyer because as we are establishing, and many people understand this who are in the cemetery industry, we have a lot of record keeping that we're responsible for. And what I was hoping to do is to streamline the process and do so in a way that was logical and also factual. So having Dr. Sawyer not only help us to establish the cemetery layout, where is a good spot for burials, where is not a good spot for burial, where's the ledge? We're not going to be able to dig in ledge. Don't bother bringing your shovel out there. And having that ability to create a map based on GIS information. And then once we're there, I wanted to be able to say, why can't we integrate the legacy information, the cemetery record keeping information into this same map? So we have one point of reference that is safe and stored and accessible. So we're not reaching for a drawer and opening that drawer to find a number on a plot. We are not trying to find vital record information in a spreadsheet over here versus on a land sheet here. I wanted one point of contact for everything because streamlining our information is cost effective, it's time saving, and that time and cost we can pass along to our families. The better we are at doing our jobs in a cost-effective and way of technology, the better we protect the legacy rights that we are selling them, as well as keeping costs down that we can in turn save our families. So what I asked Dr. Sawyer to do is, can I store in my map, I have the GPS location of the burial. I want to be able to go to that. I want to know a person's cremation number. We happen to do deed recording of every burial, so I want to be able to know what book and page number, if a person wants to pull their deed of the deeded plot of their plot. I want their dates. I want beneficiary information recorded on the map itself. So a lot of people will have somebody much younger, a child, be their beneficiary. So when we are gone, that child's name is associated to the map, to the land, to the deed, giving them rights to that space. And Dr. Sawyer stepped up. So here we go.
So I think Mel just took care of the whole slide for me.
You're welcome.
So yeah, so GIS mapping can do things that just basic spreadsheets can't, because it's incorporating all this information into the map. It's connecting that spatial data with the data that Mel was talking about. So let's look back at this example of the Henniker map. And so let's look at what we can do with burial sites with information that can be included in GIS files. So we have this hypothetical cemetery. We have this idea of slopes. And let's suppose that we have 99 different burials on here on this 40 acres. And these different crosses and circles and dots represent different cemeteries, different age groups, different types of trees.
You mean different burial people?
I'm sorry, different burial people.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Different funeral homes is
Okay.
what I meant, excuse
Okay.
me. Different funeral homes that service the different families. And so what we have is, you can see that we have a parking area here on our map. You have kind of trails that go through. We see that we have no burials adjacent to our, in our wetlands area, no burials in our, except for maybe a couple of little cottonwood trees or little,
You and the cottonwood trees.
you know,
We're dreaming of warm weather.
it's a little rainy outside.
Mm.
In our poorly drained areas. But what we do see is we have clumps of pockets of where the families seem to go together. And what we can do is we can use that data and we can look to see, where are the children buried? Perhaps you have a child memorial day. And we can say, well, where are the plots where we have children under the age of 18 or younger? And we can use our map and pull out that information instead of having somebody go through and check 99 different plots and count which ones are under 18. We can easily use our GIS map to pull that up. We can say, where are all the plots from the same funeral home? If you're a funeral home looking to see, well, how am I doing in this relationship with the cemetery? How are our families working together with the cemetery? Do I have a good working relationship with the cemetery? We can provide that information to that funeral home.
As well as death doulas, any information as far as who tended to the family. So we can record our death doula information if they did not work with a funeral home.
Yes. Or we can, or this could be a connection with somebody who who has beneficiaries listed versus people who don't have beneficiaries
Mhm.
listed. This is an example of just how you can filter out different data. For this particular grouping, we see that in this case, this funeral home works with mostly younger folks. There's one person over 80, one person at 64, two people in their 40s, and the rest are under 20s, in their 20s or younger. So we see that this is a funeral home that works much with the younger folks. We can also see that there's clumps of families. So if we look in our data and we say, where is the Brooks family? We see that there's a plot together. And if we go back, we can see that it's a child that has not made the age of 1 yet, a 9-year-old and an 80-year-old. So we have a grandparent buried with 2 grandchildren right in the same plot. And so that funeral home was able to service that family in their time of need and plant their trees together. So all of this information is something that the map can help us provide, that GIS technology can help us provide to the families, to the funeral homes, to the doulas, to ourselves, to help make life forest and make a conservation cemetery, make more informed decisions. What we can do is we can say, where are the trees that we are planting? What type of tree? For Sarah Brooks, it's a cherry tree. The tree has a 7-foot diameter. It was planted on 5/26. We have the date of death, the date of birth, the funeral home for this particular individual. We have the GPS coordinates for the individual, so we can record it in the deed.
No, no,
Okay.
I was just listening.
We can say that for Fern, she has a pine. Maybe her favorite tree was a pine. These are just examples. Cherries don't necessarily go next to pine trees. But what we have is that we can get different ideas of how to plant our forest such that it's biologically reasonable. We work with tree experts to make sure we're planting like things near each other or things that complement each other. And this map helps us ensure that we have a broad sense of what's happening in our forest, so we're not losing the forest for the trees.
Ooh. The other part of this is, and this is kind of a newer approach, but we are monitored by the Department of Agriculture because we are planting and sustaining trees on other people's behalf. So beyond cemetery law, you have to follow agricultural law. And you have to make sure that the trees do not negatively cross-pollinate with one another. So we have to provide information to the Department of Agriculture in order to say, here's where the layout is, here's the planned trees, and here's the spacing in which they must be. The other part of this is because families have ownership rights. The cherry tree will only have a certain lifespan, as will any tree. It's a living object. So they will have the coordinates of their space. They will know what type of tree they have a right to, and they have replanting rights in the future through the deed of the land. And all of that is recorded in the map of the property.
So for the next little portion of time, what I would like to show you is this GIS mapping in real time. So you can see how I'm doing this mapping with this example plot. And so we can discuss a little bit more about how the technology itself works. So let me switch my screens here to the example map. So you should be seeing a different version of the map. If I can get a thumbs up, okay, perfect. Okay, so here's that original map that we saw. And so this is in the program QGIS, which some folks use ArcGIS or ArcPro. There's different sorts of mapping programs. This one happens to be the one that I'm most familiar with. But the idea with GIS mapping is you use this geographic information data, and you manipulate it in this program or in a program similar to this. So we have, for example, all the road boundaries in New Hampshire. So as you see it populating, we see the roads in New Hampshire. So you can kind of see the 93, here's Manchester down here. We see the southern part of New Hampshire, the Portsmouth area. We see the 93 corridor up north. We see we've got a big spot in the White Mountains, the Kancamagus Highway. Here's like through Carroll. And so what we get is we get kind of an overall picture. We can zoom into Henniker. Here's our Henniker map here shown in white in this sense. We can zoom to that and we can look at Henniker's roads or in Henniker's conservation soils, which is not showing up here. We'll look at the potential land instead. So we can look at that potential land map instead. So we see the water boundaries, we see the soil boundaries. We can look at the soil and we can look at the labels for the soils. So all of this information, we can look and say, well, what type of information does the soil have? It has the label of Meadows Edge peat, 0 to 1% slopes, Peru fine sandy loam, very stony areas. So is stony good for what we're doing? Is it going to be difficult to dig in? Is it going to be more trouble than it's worth? Is it a cost saving measure?
This also helps in any sort of conservation cemetery. When you're planting anything, you can provide this data directly to the soil scientists that you're working with and ask them, okay, you know, here we're doing a pollinator garden and the soil is, you know, poorly drained or moderately drained. It happens to be sandy loam. What kind of nutrients do you recommend that I add to the soil for the success of my pollinator garden? And people with that education can take this information and produce for you a viable garden area, or they can say, you know, I would rethink that approach. I wouldn't do that in that spot. So we kind of fielded a lot of things prior to the purchase of Life Forest land, knowing what we were looking for as far as protection of trees and viability of plantings, as well as abutting conservation land and working with different conservation entities.
And yeah, and so we can look at like the burial plots here under the potential land. So we see the different trees. So if I click on our little, sorry, I have to move the cursor here. I can click on a particular entity and I see that this is a pine tree. No name is assigned here, but we have a tree type is pine. It's a 5-foot diameter. It was planted on 11/10/2021. I can run statistics on my model. I can just figure out how many people I have under the age of 10. I can determine how many individuals I have over the age of 50.
So this is an example map that Dr. Sawyer has put together just to kind of show you the ease of use in this. But what we have found in active use in using these dynamic GIS maps is that we can get a phone call and that person will say, you know, my sister is buried at Life Forest. I really want a pre-need plot within proximity to my sister. And we can say, okay, what's your sister's name? Type in the name and it will bring us the information about what plot that person's in. We can click on her plot and we can say to her, we have X amount of spots available or not available right next to your sister's plot. Once those plots are assigned, we can put in the deed that those pre-need plots are purchased, who they were purchased by, who the beneficiaries are, and right of ways to that space, all within the map, as well as record the deed book and page on that map itself. So that gives people, instead of trying to like protect the legal rights of the person, we're just giving them their legal rights.
Dr. Sawyer, we've got a question in terms of what is the scale of the map, or more specifically, how close can you cite a tree?
With the triangulation,
Like,
I think.
so with like the GPS coordinates, is that the question?
I believe so. So, you know, what one of those dots, how big a point is that?
Oh, so like so this is a 15-foot diameter around this tree.
That gives a space for the tree to grow and thrive.
Yeah,
Right.
so this particular category is about 40 acres in the scale of Hillsborough, or excuse me, Henniker.
Thank you.
So if we orient it in Henniker itself, it's approximately this large. So it's, you know, a good chunk of the size of downtown. You know, maybe a ninth or so of the main downtown area, so 40 acres. Again, this is an example map to show like how the trees are spaced out, but also I chose it to show the wetlands area and the different slopes. So very much an example for illustrative purposes only.
Was that the question?
I think it was just how big the tree was in relative to like the town. So I will definitely open this up for questions now. I see that there's a couple of, the chat number has been going up and I just want to make sure that we have time for some questions.
Can I see this screen shared with the people in it?
Yeah.
Can you see the chat, Dr. Sawyer, or?
Yes, I had it blocked so that way we could see our screen. So let me pull it. Okay, there's a lot of questions. Okay. So instead of columns on the spreadsheet, you have layers on the map. Yes, essentially. So The first question I see is, so instead of columns on the spreadsheet, we have layers on the map, and that's what we have on the right-hand side here. We have the different like funeral homes, date of birth, date of death, tree type, tree diameter. Those are the layers that we have that would essentially be the columns on our spreadsheet. But now we can do different calculations. So we can map these GPS coordinates and we can find the average date of death, a date of death in a particular range, much like you would on a spreadsheet, but now it's all conglomerated and associated with that picture on the map. The program is QGIS, it's open source. Which is free, which Life Forest.
We started with that. We've ended up purchasing a more expensive software and then integrating into the QCGIS mapping into that software. But we started with QCGIS to make sure that it was going to work and not to buy a very expensive software that wasn't necessary or wasn't viable.
Yeah, but QGIS is definitely very workable. It's a software that I'm familiar with, so that's why we started with it. And that's good for illustrative purposes. Where is your data stored, backed up? It seems to be a big part of what cemetery software programs offer.
So cemetery software programs for us, especially as a smaller entity, were very, very expensive. So we store the data directly into the mapping file and then back up the mapping file as we would any other file that you have on, your computer. So we have backups of it, but we also, frankly, we store paper copies. We store it in so many different places, but because we deed everything, it's also stored with the Registry of Deeds.
So what is this?
Look at this reading. Look.
So I think this might have been the question that was asked earlier, but I'll ask it again. So what is the scale of these maps within how many feet can you locate a tree plot? Okay, so this has to do with the GPS.
More exact location, yeah.
So I think with the current GPS devices that we're using, I think it's within a guaranteed 10-foot radius, like a 3-meter radius. But I think there is more accuracy as you let the GPS device set and calibrate over a multiple of days. What you can do is you can triangulate your points. So if you take your average of points over several different visits, you can triangulate those points to get a better accuracy. But one initial read, I think, is within a 10-foot.
Yeah, we have it within 2 feet on
2
the
feet.
amount of, so we'll place it at the planting spot and we'll be within 2 feet. And so we know that that tree will be within 2 feet because the trees are all bigger than that. It's that place. So.
And then what GPS GNS device do you use for reporting? So
What was that?
currently we're using a Garmin device, if that's the question. I want to make sure I'm understanding the question. How are you thinking about adapting to future changes in technology? For example, QR codes will probably change and be replaced by different systems in the future.
So what we do with our QR codes and to ensure that they stay viable, first of all, the QR codes are not located on any digital devices at all. The QR codes are solely used as a little marker on the base of the tree to keep it inexpensive for the families and to be able to keep it and make sure that they're updated. Basically the metal stake itself has an attachment, a 2-inch square aluminum attachment. That QR code is essentially a sticker on that attachment. So if there's any changes in the QR code, we can reprint that QR code sticker at a cost of about $2. But also we're now working with different, we're actually ahead of the QR code as well. And so it will be a matter of just taking the screw off and removing that plate and replacing that plate with the later technology.
How or where did you get the different soil types for the area? So all the data that we got for the soil types, the wetlands data, all of that information we got from the granite.unh.edu. So that if you just search granite, granite without an E, it's GRANIT, and GIS data. The New Hampshire database has a plethora of data. It's almost overwhelming how much data they have for New Hampshire data. I imagine other states have similar databases. So try looking for publicly available data that way. Soil data public GIS.
The other place is I would utilize whatever town you're researching, go into their tax maps. So if you can get a hold of the town in which you are interested in, ask for their tax map, get your map and lot location. Once you have the map and lot location, you can pull up, basically, it's a record that people use in order to know who owns the land, the tax value of the land. But with underneath that, many townships are purchasing ArcGIS background software. So you can actually access so much information through the tax area of the town's website. And I'm sure a lot of you already know that. I can't read. Can you see that? Where's my glasses?
How much does your GIS device cost new? Asking because a software company suggests we buy one that costs around $25,000. Definitely not.
Not $25,000. So we work very hard to try to make sure that we create systems that are affordable and sustainable, because we do not charge any annual upkeep for our families. So we don't want to take on anything that's so expensive that we then in turn have to gouge our pricing for our families. So I think we paid $300.
Yeah,
for about
$300 or $400.
For a map. It's a higher end tracking device that could be used for hiking into remote places, things like that.
Mhm. Yeah, so higher end devices are much more accurate. That is, so I'm skipping over a question just to come back to that question. So yes, higher end devices are much more accurate and reliable for remote areas. We are not in a super remote area. So that is something that we would explore if we if we were jumping to a remote area. So do take that into consideration if you are looking at cemetery planning in a remote area. Again, conservation cemeteries, like planning, that is incorporated in your understanding of the area. Have you any experience with homing devices that transmit a signal from the spot to locate the graves or trees?
Are they asking about like those flying devices? I don't think so.
I don't think we have any experience with homing devices.
I don't know. No, I don't. I would know. I don't
Yeah.
have anything home and on.
I don't think so.
No. Are you supporting and storing the QR data or using third party? We do it ourselves. We use it through our website. We create a celebration of life page that we link to directly at our website. And so then I use a QR code software online to create the QR link from our website memorial page. Families give me the information they want. We update our page and we create a QR code in which we print on our markers. So no third party, no. Again, the lower the cost, the less we have to pass on to the consumer.
Yeah. So just in closing, we want to just ensure that we're using today's technology to honor people's legacy and to protect the environment. It's our goal at Life Forest to make sure that the environment is preserved, but so that people can go back to visit their great grandfather, to have that history of the family. We would like to make sure that we can bring cemetery trends, like the cemetery traditions, that we preserve traditions, but bring it out of antiquity.
Yeah, and so part of our credo is to constantly ask ourselves, are we utilizing technology in the best of ways in order to protect our families, save our families' cost, as well as protect the environment? I think technology and nature seem to be used in different sentences normally, but I don't know that is necessary in the world that we're living in as far as cemeteries. If we can utilize it correctly, I think we can enjoy nature and allow technology to give us that time, space, and cost savings in order to be able to know that we are doing the right thing for our families. Are there any other questions?
Let me check the chat. So One question about QR data that we have online does not include in vitals information. How are you handling that?
So QR data for the vital information is tied into the mapping. So the QR code is simply for on-site memorialization. So the QR code, many people, and I think anybody that has any sort of association with green burial, people want like, well, I love the idea of natural environment, but what about like this? Like, what can I just leave this giant bird bath? And can I do a bench? And can I have a stone? And they just lose sight of the idea. So we say, you know what, you can have something, you can have this 2-inch square, and we're gonna memorialize your loved one through that. So if they wanted to put vital information on their celebration page, of course they could do so. But the QR code, the only purpose the QR code serves is memorialization of their loved one and personal information in which the family would like to share. Not all of the families choose that. So it's not like we require them to have a QR code at the base of their tree. It's just for the families that want it. We offer it. It's a free service. It doesn't, cost us a lot. And it kind of thwarts this desire to place a lot of tchotchke, if that makes any sense to anybody.
Well, I'm going to have to jump in here because we've come to the end of our time, but this was absolutely fantastic. And I learned so much, and I've got a whole list of takeaways. But the one thing, Mel, I had never thought about was the inequity. When you walk into a cemetery and you see the different tombstones, and I'm a big fan of cemeteries, so I always go visit, but that's another big takeaway. Well, thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Thank you, Mel. You provided
Absolutely.
a tremendous amount of information.